Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're watching from. Uh, I'm Twain Taylor, editor at Amazic, and I'm delighted to bring to you another episode here where we talk to industry leaders and influencers in the cloud native and the Kubernetes space. We focus exclusively on this space, so we make sure we give you the best and the most important ideas today. And if you like what you hear today, I want to encourage you to head over to amazic.com, which is where everything happens. We put up all of our cool stuff there. We've got event coverage. In December, we have Amazic World. That's an event happening in Europe. We have regular articles that come out, and we do a lot of interviews like this on a weekly, monthly basis. And there's even job listings. So, if you're in this space, amazic.com is where you want to go to keep track of what's happening in the space. So that said, I'm excited to welcome our guest for today. We have, I'm going to try to get her name right, but she's going to obviously have to help me out after this, but it's Edidiong Asikpo. Okay, I hope I got that almost right, but she's...
Yeah, you got it well.
She is the Senior Developer Advocate at Ambassador Labs. Edidiong, welcome to the show. It's great to have you. And if you can just tell us your name once again, just so we get it right.
Sure, thanks for having me. My name is Edidiong Asikpo. Yeah, so you did do a good job of pronouncing it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's great to have you with us here. If you could just get us started with, telling us a bit about yourself and just your journey so far up to Ambassador Labs, that would be a great starting point.
All right, cool. So I have generally been in like the tech ecosystem since, let's say, late 2017. I mean, I was still like in college at the time, and I was still doing like internships here and there. So I've generally been in like the web development ecosystem and done dev for a couple of times, and also managed developer communities. But we're in 2020, right? Okay, yeah. So in 2021, I officially made the switch to like cloud native and DevOps space. I had learned about like Kubernetes while I used to work at this company called InterSwitch as a software engineer. Mm-hmm. And so I had this DevOps person who used to sit like right beside me, right? So whenever applications would go down or something goes wrong, everybody would always come and be like, "Hey, Abdul, this thing is down. Like, why is it not working?" And then you hear him say like, "Oh no, Kubernetes is this," or like Kibana is that. So it just felt very like fascinating to me, right? And I was like, okay, I think I'd love to do this thing at some point in life. So I eventually left that company, and I still stuck with like web development and a bit of technical writing, right? And so at some point I got reached out by like the HR person at Ambassador Labs, asking if I wanted to join the company. And in my head, I'm like, okay, I'm not into cloud native, so I don't know how impactful I would be to join the company, right? But I was like, okay, hey, I'm open to having this conversation and seeing how things go. So I had the conversation, and they were like, oh, hey, they're open to giving me an opportunity to learn about like Kubernetes and the cloud native on the job. And I was like, yeah, this seems like the universe is saying it's finally time for me to go into learning about Kubernetes and like all of those interesting things I heard the DevOps person say during that time. And yeah, so I did the interviews, got the job, and yeah, it's been amazing ever since. I mean, there were definitely moments where it feels very overwhelming to like learn so many new things at the same time, while also still having to provide value to the company. But I feel like the cloud native and like Kubernetes ecosystem is very very conducive, very supportive, right? You'd always see people who are willing to like help you understand something. You could like reach out to this person on Twitter, or even just make a general tweet about like something that's confusing to you, and you see so many people respond to you. And that just gave me the courage and the knowledge to be able to like continue my learning journey and just be open and know that, yeah, maybe I'm not where I want to be. I'm not like there, but it's like progress, right? Take it one step at a time and see how things go. So it's been really great to have made the switch. I don't look back and be like, oh, I made a wrong decision. So it looks fantastic, and I'm excited to keep learning and seeing how things go in the cloud native ecosystem.
Mhm. Yeah, wow. So yeah, I'm so excited to have you on the show, because it's rare to have women in tech, speak, and we've had one so far. So you're the second. And it's probably even more rare to have someone from the continent of Africa. So,
Yeah.
in that sense, I think, this is really great. And shout out to your colleague, Dave Sudia, who
Yeah.
actually suggested we have you on the show. And he's as well from Ambassador Labs. So if you're watching this and you want to know more about Ambassador Labs and what they do, check out this other podcast of ours featuring Dave Sudia. So
Awesome.
so getting into our topic for today, we are going to talk about developer environments and specifically for Kubernetes. If you could get us started giving us a very basic overview of a developer environment, what is it, why is it important, and a bit about what's different when it comes to Kubernetes, developer environments for Kubernetes. If you could get us started with an overview there, that would be great.
Oh, sure. So in my opinion, I generally think of development environments as, let's say a tool, like a platform where software is being built and managed using code and features like it could be refactoring, cleaning, etc. But it's generally like a place where you can like manage and make changes to your code base. So in terms of importance, I think that a couple of importance come to mind, but like two, or maybe say one specific one is that development environments serve as, let's say, safe place for developers to test anything they want, right? Without being necessarily worried with it impacting end users or breaking something in production, right? And I think one of the key things about Kubernetes development environments and other ones is that previously, remember the time where developers would be like, oh, hey, it worked on my machine, right? So you try to build something and then you're not supposed to make other people test it and it doesn't work for them. And then you come up and say, oh no, it worked on my machine, like all of this. Well, in some cases it was true, but sometimes I think it was just excuses people made when they did not do what they were supposed to do. But I think, so imagine if you're using like a remote developer environment right now in Kubernetes, it means that if something actually did work for you and you're trying it out yourself, it would work for the other developer, but because you guys are sharing the same development environment, right? And it also makes it a lot easier to do like more realistic testing, right? Because most often than not, these resources or services you want to test against is already available in this remote development environment. So you can just test them directly instead of, let's say, creating those stubs that does not give you the actual like resources or things that may be in production where you eventually push it. So that's generally what I think about development environments, the importance of it and how it's quite different from like Kubernetes and when you used to work with the monolithic architecture.
Yeah, so essentially you're saying it deals with this works on my machine syndrome where, it brings more consistency. Kubernetes helps with that.
Yes.
If you could talk to us a bit about what's the lay of the land? What are the different options in terms of an IDE? What makes a good IDE versus one that's not so great?
Yeah, so I think generally, like the goal of every development team is to code and ship features faster to their users, right? Like you want to get this, let's say, like it could be a feature, it could be a bug fix, but you want to ensure that the experience of the users of your product is actually good, right? And if you think about it, one of the reasons why most cloud native companies, or one of the reasons why people adopted Kubernetes was because it promised them to help them code and ship faster, right? And of course, even though Kubernetes has some of those benefits like containerization, helping you to like be able to test an application or see an application on how it works without necessarily having all of those let's say like resources or things that you need to run them on your computer. What you generally want is like a workflow or like a space where you can like quickly make a code change, test the impact of this, your code changes before shipping into production. So how I generally think of it is there are like different development environments in Kubernetes, right? There is the local development environment where everything runs locally, you make a code change, and because it's running locally, you can immediately see that impact of the code changes. But one of the downsides of local development environments is that, there's only so much your laptop can do, right? Sometimes you're probably just even, let's say on a Zoom call, you're responding to Slack messages, and a few times you see your laptop hanging. So imagine running a really large developer environment on your laptop. It can only do so much. Yes, it will take you to a certain level, but not so much at some point. So it's not very sustainable. And then the other route is the remote development environment where everything runs remotely. So it means that when you make a code change locally, you'd have to build you have to containerize that application, push it to like a registry, like let's say Docker Hub or maybe Quay by Red Hat or any other private registry you use, and then deploy it into the remote Kubernetes cluster, right? The benefits of this development environment is that you can test against more realistic resources, right? Let's say the other services that are part of the cloud native application or the database or like whatever thing you're testing against. But the downside to this is that you would always have to go through that build push test cycle, right? And even though a lot of people tend to overlook the build push test cycle, I think it's like one of the things that impacts the developer experience in Kubernetes, right? Because imagine if containerizing the application would take you like 5 minutes. Sometimes it could even be more than that. And you eventually push it to the remote development environment, then you realize that something did not work as expected. It means you have to come back, rebuild that application all over again, and then go through the same process. So if you think about all those minutes that you're, well, I don't know if wasting is the word, but if you think about all those minutes that you're using to like rebuild your application and like re-uploading it or redeploying it into the Kubernetes cluster, you could have used it for something more, let's say useful or more impactful, like actually writing the code, right? So for me, I think a great development environment, right, in Kubernetes is something that allows you to enjoy the best of both worlds. For instance, you enjoy being able to use like your local debugger, right, which you would have gotten in the local development environment, but then you also get to benefit the actual realistic testing that you would get in a remote-based environment. So we kind of like call that remocal, which means local to remote, right? So it's enjoying the benefits of the local development environment and the remote development environment and kind of merging it into one thing. So that means you now have a development environment that allows you to be able to see the impact of your code changes as fast as possible. Because once you can see the impact of those code changes, it means that you can now ship faster to the end users. And if something is wrong with the first iteration you make, you can quickly make the second iteration, make the third iteration, instead of spending like 5 to 10 minutes on each iteration if you had to, let's say, build or containerize your application each time.
All right. Wow. Yeah, you packed a lot into that response. And I definitely want to dig more into kind of the smoke testing or, the sort of testing you can have while writing code itself. I want to know more about that. Sounds very interesting.
Yeah.
Just to backstep a little bit and dig into a little bit more about to discover the anti-patterns when we talk about provisioning developer environments. Typically, I think there's probably a lot of back and forth between the developer and the ops team that's provisioning the developer environment. Could you talk a bit about that process and, the back and forth, how it costs developers time and some of the anti-patterns you see with organizations? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, you definitely hear people share like different concerns about this, right? You have folks who have a development environment where the ops team is like managing every single thing, and maybe they would always need to have certain permissions to access or let's say deploy or test against other services. And in an environment like that, it means that there would often be some like laybacks or some time wastages, right, for these developers, because it means that each time they need to do something, they have to wait for someone in the ops team to approve it. Of course, it comes with its benefits, right, which means that, yeah, maybe it's a lot more secure. There's a lot more like control and stability of what's happening. Like they know, hey, this person is doing this or this person is doing that, right? But then it also comes with its own implications. So in regards to anti-patterns, I've seen people use different tools that help to make this a lot more easier, like impactful, for instance. So there's this tool called Telepresence, right, which enables people to be able to like secure their infrastructure, right? So it means that if you integrate with Teleport, right, and then developers, anytime any developer does something inside a Kubernetes cluster, there's like a track rail, right? You can go to the audits log and you can see who did what at a certain time. And this also helps the ops team to be able to make approvals a lot easier because they're like integrations with, let's say, Slack, for instance. So if I only had access to view and, let's say, get Kubernetes resources, right? But then I want to be able to edit the Kubernetes resource because there is this bug that just came up and another developer is not there to resolve it. So instead of just waiting because I don't have access to it, I can quickly request for access, right? And the ops team or ops person can get like a notification on Slack, right? That says, hey, Edidiong just requested for access for this. I've already included an explanation of why I need that access. And if they approve the request, then it means I now have access to make that code change. And another interesting thing there is there are like certain time limitations, right? So maybe I could have access for, let's say, 10 hours or 4 hours. Then it means that after that 4 hours, I automatically lose access to that. So it falls back to more security without necessarily having to wait for someone to always like approve it or wait for someone to come back from lunch before you can eventually make a change that would have maybe saved the company a couple of money or prevented like a huge bug from affecting a larger number of users. So I would say that different things work for different companies. So it's always important to look through, hey, what are you trying to achieve? What kind of experience are you trying to create for your developers? Because having a good developer experience is very, very important. I know everybody's always concerned about the users and like the user experience, but we really need to think about the developer experience as well, because if these developers don't have like a good experience, right, then it's a lot more challenging for them to make the users happy eventually because they won't be as productive as they're supposed to be, or they won't be able to provide as much feedback as they want to because of the level at which the company is managing their development environment.
All right. Yeah. So I want to get into talking about telepresence in the next question, but just the last question before that I wanted to ask is, in terms of company size, you're talking about different companies, there are different priorities. Do you see differences in terms of the size of the company? Do smaller organizations handle developer environments different from larger organizations? And if so, what are some of the differences that you've seen?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very good question. And yes, a lot of companies do that. So you see, like, for instance, with smaller companies who are just like starting out or don't necessarily have a lot of money, you'd see those kind of companies leaning towards the local development environments, right? Because they're trying to manage resources. They're like, let's say 4 to 5 people in the team, so they can all run their Kubernetes clusters locally, right? But then for larger teams, let's say like hundreds to hundreds of people, it's almost impossible to do that locally, right? Because you want to bring every single like developer on board on what is happening. So those kind of teams lean more into utilizing like remote development environments or a combination of them, which could be the local to remote development environment. And I mean, aside from team size, another thing to put into play is how large or big the cloud native application is, right? So if your cloud native application has, let's say, 500 microservices and another team's cloud native application has 10 microservices, the people with 10 microservices are absolutely okay with running it locally, right? But folks with like 500 microservices cannot run it locally. Like there's a certain point where your laptop would not be able to do or run certain like microservices. It would take hours for it to load, and no company wants to waste like meaningful time waiting for like a cognitive application to load or even build when you can use that to do something more productive. So yes, I think the size of the company and also how large the cloud native application is definitely matters when people when people think about the right developer environment to use.
All right. And with that, I wanted to just get into talking about Telepresence, which is the product that you work closely with. If you could give us the elevator pitch for Telepresence and what's its the main selling point of Telepresence, that would be a great start for us.
Sure, absolutely. Quick one, right? So if you think about, there's something called the inner development loop. So the inner development loop, for people who don't know, is like where the developers write code and test their changes, while the outer development loop is like everything that happens after you push it to GitHub or GitLab or whatever version control system you're using. So, and if you think about it, right, before you eventually push something out there, it means the thing has to have been built, right? Before you can eventually deploy something to production, you need to build it. So this building part is like one of the key things, because if that does not exist, then every other thing would not happen. So when we used to work with like the monolithic architecture, ideally when you, let's say, make a code change, all you needed to do was like, let's say, click on hot reloading or use a certain IDE that allowed you to quickly see the impact of your code changes. But with containerized environments now, you have to build the container, push the container to a registry, and then deploy to a Kubernetes cluster before you can see the impact of your code changes. And even though people like to maybe overlook this, right, they don't really get how impactful it can be, because sometimes if it would have taken you let's say like 80 iterations when you're working with the monolithic architecture, with cloud native architecture now, sorry, microservice architecture, it would it reduces it by like 20, for instance. So you would now probably take you 50 iterations. And because you now have a lower number of iterations, it means that the chances of you getting things shipped is no longer as fast as it used to be, right? So what Telepresence does is it allows you to skip through that build process cycle. This means that it lets you connect your local development environment, which could be like a computer, for instance, to a remote Kubernetes cluster, right? So that way, imagine if there was a bug in, so let's say you had this application called Emoji Voter, right? And the Emoji Voter application had 4 Kubernetes services. So your users have complained that there is something wrong with the voting service, right? So as a developer, you go to your laptop, you open up your IDE, you try to fix the problem, right? And after you fix that problem, the next thing you would have done is, hey, containerize this application, deploy it, and then, push it to a registry and then deploy it. And that would probably take you a couple of minutes, sometimes maybe an hour, depending on how large the application is. But now with Telepresence, you don't need to go through all those build process cycle. What you do is connect your local development environment to a remote Kubernetes cluster that has those other 3 services. That's not the voting service. Remember, the voting service is the service you're trying to update. So you've updated the voting service now, and what you want to do is confirm that this voting service is going to work perfectly with those other 3 services in the remote Kubernetes cluster. So once you make that connection, you can now test to see, hey, does this thing work as expected? Would it work when I push it to production? And another interesting thing here is that you can then share, because Telepresence generates a preview URL that shows you how your local code changes, which is the voting service, is working with the other services in the remote Kubernetes cluster. So I can then copy this preview URL and send it to you, for instance, if you were my manager, and you can immediately see what I am trying to do. That means you no longer have to wait for me to push it to GitHub for you to see and review it, right? You immediately see what I'm trying to do and give me feedback. So once I go back, implement that feedback, share the preview URL with you again. And once we are both comfortable with like what the state of the application looks like, right? Then I can then push it to GitHub. And then it means that at this point when it goes to GitHub, we're already we're already confident with what we've pushed. And we know that if we eventually push this thing to production, it would benefit the users and would most likely, let's say, fix the bug.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, It kind of reminds me of just the concept of shift left testing, which is, just getting immediate feedback on the code that you write. Seems like Telepresence really delivers on that.
Yes.
So, for QA teams, what's it like? Do QA teams as well use Telepresence to perform tests, or does it reduce the need for QA team to do too many tests? What's the impact on the QA team?
That's an interesting question. I think, yes, it definitely reduces the need for the QA team to do it, because it means that the developer, right, is actually doing the tests themselves, right? Or is actually doing the, is confirming that what the code changes that they have made is going to interact well with the other services that, let's say, are in production or working as expected. So once it's almost like documentation, for instance, right? How people believe that, oh, developers should be the ones doing the documentation because they have a better knowledge of what they're actually building, right? So imagine if you have like a docs person in your team, and then you also have like developers who are doing documentation. It means that once this developer writes this documentation, maybe they may not know the right like words to use or like to craft it perfectly. But once they write that first draft, it's easier for the docs person to now modify that to make it better. And once this happens, it means that anybody who reads this documentation gets the full picture, right? So it's like that with this as well. So once the developer does the first testing, ensuring that its update is working with other services in the remote Kubernetes cluster, it means that there's a certain level of confirmation, right? So it means that when the QA team eventually does this, it's a lot easier for them. Everything is already set up, and it just makes the whole journey and experience for both the developer, the QA person, and eventually the users, because it means that they will be able to ship features a lot faster because everything is already confirmed before it reaches the QA and then eventually gets pushed to production.
Yeah, I think that's a great example about the docs team and just making their work a lot easier. Because of really close coordination with devs just built into the process, and I think that's really powerful when you think of what Telepresence does for QA testing. I wanted to ask a bit about just what happens under the hood with Telepresence. So you mentioned like in a large application with like 500 microservices, there's a lot of processing to be done, even for that testing to happen on a big application. Where is this happening? Is it on the cloud? Where does Telepresence actually have this? Is it a copy of the production cluster? What's happening under the hood?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So let me try to break it down, let's say the way that would make sense. So generally you think, so let's say there's a certain application running in production, right, where you can access, right? And I am the developer in this case, right? I'm trying to make a code change to one of those services in the application. For context, because I want to run this thing locally, or because I'm trying to test locally, I'm only making a code change to my own local service, not any other one that is running in production. Okay, sorry, let me take a step back. So assuming there are, like you said, 500 services, let's just name the first of those 500 services, service A, B, C, D, right? Just to make it smaller so you can get the context. And I want to make a code change to service D. Right? On a normal sense, I can't run 500 of these microservices on my computer because my computer cannot handle that, right? But I want to make a code change to only service D. So I go to, let's say, VS Code, for instance, and I make the code changes, and I've tested it locally that is working as expected. But right now, I want to confirm that this service D is going to work with service A, service B, service C, and all the other 500 microservices, right? So instead of me to do a Docker build, Docker push, and then deploy it to the Kubernetes cluster, what I will do is create something called an intercept with Telepresence. So what that does is going to create like a tunnel between my computer and the remote Kubernetes cluster that contains these other 499 services. So other 500 services actually. And then what I'll do is I'm now going to redirect the traffic that was supposed to go to service D in the remote Kubernetes cluster to the service D running on my computer, right? Okay. So if anybody goes to that, so let's assume the application was hosted at, let's say Edidiong.com. If anybody goes to Edidiong.com and interacts with the application, they are now going to be hitting the service D running on my computer, no longer the service D that is inside the remote Kubernetes cluster. I don't know if that makes sense. So what that does now is, because someone can test and hit this service that I have locally, I can confirm that it's going to work as expected. I can make a couple of changes, I can make a couple of tweaks and be like, oh, hey, this is not going well, or this is going well, I need to update that. And once I'm in a more comfortable state, I can then push this thing to GitHub or GitLab, whatever platform I'm using. So Telepresence just basically makes it easier for you to test the impact of your code changes with other remote services or with other dependencies to be like the database, right? Without necessarily having to run everything locally or run everything remotely, right? Because now that I'm running my local service locally, sorry, now that I'm running service D locally, right? If I wanted to use a debugger that VS Code has, I can still do that. But if I'm running it remotely, then it means I no longer have access to things like that. It could even be like logs, for instance. But because this service is running on my computer, I can still have access to those many benefits of running things locally. But then again, I want to test that this thing I'm doing is going to work in a very realistic environment. So I can now connect my remote Kubernetes cluster to my computer. So without necessarily deploying it into the remote Kubernetes cluster, I can still get the benefits of both worlds, which is being able to use my debugger and being able to use the realistic environment that exists in the remote Kubernetes cluster.
All right. And in terms of resources, is there, does using telepresence require you to provision additional resources for this kind of testing, or is that not required?
No, it doesn't require. In retrospect, Telepresence actually makes you to reduce the number of resources that you have. So if you probably had like 5 clusters, right? With Telepresence now, you no longer have to like create all of those clusters, because all you just need to do is have your laptop where the local service is running on and connect that your laptop to the remote Kubernetes cluster. So there is like an option for different people to be able to share that cluster, or there's something called global intercept, and there's something called personal intercept. So personal intercept only sends traffic to a specific header, meaning that even if someone goes to edidiong.com, for instance, they'll still be hitting the service D in the remote Kubernetes cluster. But if they go to the particular header that I set, then they're now hitting the service D in my own local machine. So there's a way to like partition it so that it doesn't affect other developers or other like end users, right? Let's say you just want to do the testing on your own. You don't want any other person to see the code change that you have made. Then there's a way to minimize that.
All right, great. And just talking about that, how does Telepresence handle things related to security? With so many developers, building stuff at the same time. Ops and the SecOps team, they're concerned about stuff not breaking in production, but also just keeping things secure end to end. What are some of the security measures that Telepresence has? What does it allow ops teams and SecOps teams to do in terms of security?
Yeah, so Telepresence has or enables RBAC, which is role-based access control, where like an ops team can decide to partition it into who has access to doing certain things, right? So if you want, let's say, 10 developers to be able to like create intercepts or interact with the remote Kubernetes cluster directly from their laptop, then you can set that, right? And then we also have like integrations with like SAML, Okta, GitHub, things like that, where only people who are logged into or have access to the GitHub account, for instance, will be able to make interactions like this. So you can either use RBAC or use Auth0 or all these SSO providers, for instance. Then yes, those are like possible ways that we try to ensure that there's security when using Telepresence. And also when you share preview URLs with people, those people have to be logged in as well. So that's like another method of confirmation, right? So if I share URL with you, you need to be logged in to be able to see that URL. There's also an option to make your URL public, and then there are like certain security rules that you need to apply there so that it doesn't create any negative impact on like your testing or your reviewing that you're doing with the rest of your development team.
All right, interesting. So I understand that Telepresence is an open source project, but there's also the Ambassador Labs, the Ambassador Cloud that's also optional. Could you tell us a bit about that? What's the open source project about, and what's Ambassador Cloud about? What's different?
Sure. Yes, you're right. Telepresence does have the OSS version, which has global intercepts enabled. But once you interact or rather use the paid version with Ambassador Cloud, then you'd have more personalized options. For instance, you can create personal intercepts, where I said personal intercepts only send traffic to a certain header, whereas global intercepts send traffic to like all of it. So if I create a global intercept to my local service D, then it means that anybody who accesses the application would be hitting local service D instead of the service D in the remote Kubernetes cluster. But with personal intercept, I can decide that, oh, hey, I only want this to hit a specific header, meaning that anybody who goes to hit the application will not access it except they are hitting this particular header. So this ensures that the testing I am doing is not affecting any other developer in the team, right? Because I have more control around where this traffic is passing through. And then the second bit is that we also have like a graphical user interface on Ambassador Cloud where you can track the different services running on your Kubernetes cluster, the different services that Telepresence can interact with. We also have this feature called Saved Intercept, where let's say you have like a new team member or someone who is trying to learn how to use Telepresence. They don't need to figure out everything themselves or set up all of the configurations because you've already done this as, let's say, the first user who utilized Telepresence. So all you just need to do is save that intercept. And anybody who wants to utilize it just goes, copy the saved intercept command and run it directly. And then it's also a bit more like support as well, right? You have access to the support team if you need more clarifications on stuff, or if you are currently experiencing like a bug, a couple of other interesting things. So Telepresence, and then another important thing I should mention is the preview URLs as well, right? So once you make a code change, you've created an intercept, but then you want someone to review that code changes that you've made. So I can copy that preview URL and send it to my manager, send it to my teammate, and they can immediately see the impact of my code changes. So again, it removes the whole doesn't work on my machine, because once I send you that link, you don't need to set it up yourself. You don't need to run it on your local machine yourself. You can just immediately, instantly see what I am doing. If you're not satisfied, all I need to do is go back to my IDE, make that code change, save it. If you click on the reload button, then you see the impact of what I have just changed. So it makes it easier to collaborate with like your teammates and maybe any other external person that you're working with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's wonderful. And how does it at all Telepresence work with the other Ambassador Labs products? I think there's one based on Emissary, which is, I think, your flagship product.
Yes.
Could you just tell us, does it work with any of those other products?
Yes, Telepresence works with MS3, Ambassador Edge Stack, even works with other service meshes like Linkerd, for instance. So if you want to utilize Telepresence and Linkerd, you can use Linkerd to debug the issue, right? Figure out where the issue is, and then use Telepresence to test the impact of the code changes that you've made to resolve that issue. So yes, Telepresence works with a couple of interesting service meshes and API gateways.
All right. Okay, we're almost at the end of our interview for today. Just probably the last question I have for you on, Kubernetes IDEs is just, what are you most excited about when you think about IDEs and what's happening in the next few months or couple of years down the line? What excites you the most?
I think it's the possibilities, to be honest, right? The fact that people are becoming more intentional about creating a great developer experience for people on their team. It's no longer just about the users, right? I mean, users are great and important, but then the developers are also important as well. So you see different tools like Telepresence, for instance, which combines the benefits of the local and the remote together to give you a more holistic approach at testing. They're like even more like certain like remote development environment tools like Git-powered, good code spaces, all these great tools, like things that we didn't think was possible, right? People are building tools and like services to make that happen. So I'm very excited to see how all of these things materialize, how mindsets of people begin to change, because I feel like people just assume that, oh, it must be done a certain way, you have to do it this way, right? But seeing the potential, seeing the differences, seeing how much more your developer experience can improve by using certain tools just makes it a lot better. And I'm really looking forward to seeing people start approaching more tools that would help them make their development team have a better experience. Because once your development team has a good experience, every other thing becomes way easier or way faster.
All right, Edidiong, thanks so much for all of that information about telepresence. Finally, if someone who is excited to check out telepresence, maybe get involved, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Sure. The OSS version of Telepresence is available at telepresence.io. If you want to check out our Slack, then you can visit a8r.io/Slack, where you can access people who are willing to respond to any question you have. And if you want to check out the paid version of Telepresence, then visit getambassador.io/product/telepresence, or just go to getambassador.io, then you see the Telepresence tab at the navigation bar.
Awesome. So with that, we come to the end of our questions on telepresence, but we have a bunch of questions for you to get to know you a bit better, Edidiong. So yeah, let's head into that. So yeah, the first question that I ask all of my guests, which really tells a bit about them, is just what would be your alternate career if not for your job in tech?
So two things. I would want to be a movie analyzer. I don't know if that exists, but I do watch lots of Netflix movies, like lots and lots of movies, which I have learned things from. So I think if there was the way I could just share those learnings with people as a career while watching them, because I love watching them, that would be great. I think the second thing would be being a lawyer. I wanted to be a lawyer when I was like really young. I think I was very argumentative, and I mean, you couldn't just tell me something without giving me reasons why this thing should be this way, right? You can't tell me, hey, did you paint this thing yellow? Why do I have to paint it in this particular color? So I've always been very, like I just want to know the reasons behind certain things, right? I don't think people should be like spoken to anyhow or directed without some sort of understanding as to why you're doing that thing. So I think being a lawyer would be a second option.
All right. Yeah, movies and the law. I'm sure you got some favorite movies on lawyers and stuff. Do you want to mention any of them?
Suits. Absolutely fantastic. Yes. It's amazing. You should definitely watch it. Yeah.
Yeah, check it out. What's a hobby or an interest that you picked up during the pandemic?
I think interest. I don't know if this fits in well, but I know that before. So when the pandemic happened, right, everybody was home. You couldn't really go out again to, like, let's say, just meet someone random on the road. And I think during that period just reminded me about how important it is to like be intentional about like your relationships, your friendships, family, and all of those stuff. And I think prior to that time, I used to be just so like focused on like work and my career and like all of that, and which wasn't really great. I mean, working is awesome, but you also need to think about life, right? Like your family, your friends, your relationships, things that just generally make you happy aside from work. And that whole experience just reminded me that I needed to be more intentional about friendships and relationships and living a happy life that does not necessarily revolve around like my career. So yeah, since then I've just tried to be more intentional about doing things that make me happy and like building relationships.
All right, nice. That's great. You're in Africa, more specifically Nigeria. So I want to ask just, what are some of the exciting developments that you see around you in the tech space, things that are happening in Africa or in Nigeria that excite you the most?
I think for me, it's seeing so many people like doing well, right? Because I mean, a couple of years back, we had lots of people who wanted to get into tech or trying to get started. But now seeing those people that you started out with doing well to a certain level, right? And it just served as an inspiration to other people who also want to get into tech, to let them know that, hey, this thing is possible, this stuff has so many benefits, and you can also do it, right? Seeing someone who looks like you, is from the same place as you are, just gives you a different level of inspiration or motivation as opposed to seeing someone who you cannot relate with, right? I think the second thing would be the exploring like other technologies. At first, it used to just be web development, but now there's like Android developers, there's cloud engineers, there's DevOps engineers, there's Web3, there is crypto. So just seeing so many people trying out different things, exploring different paths, not trying to stick with the norm that is web development. That's also very exciting to see.
Mhm. But any kind of events that you'd like to call out to, or any organizations that are doing some really cool stuff there to help bring more tech involvement in Africa?
Yes, so for events, there is an event called OSCAFE, which is Open Source Community Africa, which is centered
Okay.
around hosting open source events in Africa. And then there's She Code Africa, which is centered around bringing more women in tech into Africa. And then for companies, there is like Paystack, there is Flutterwave, there is InterSwitch, there is Alt School Africa, which is centered around creating like an engineering school, right? Where people don't necessarily, even if you didn't study computer science, it's fine. Come to alt school and then learn about computer engineering, learn about cloud, and about whatever path in tech you want to take. So yes, there are definitely organizations and companies that have been very intentional about trying to either bring people into tech, create opportunities for them. And if you think about it, these companies are one of the reasons why you see or hear about like tech ecosystem in Africa doing well, because they've been at it for like a couple of years now and have really impacted lots of lives over the years.
All right, that's great. Those are some great things you shared. So many of the people watching here, they are in a senior role, and some of them may even be considering, if I'm to have a team or even some contractors based out of Africa, where do I start? How do I go about that? Do you have any advice for them? Do they look at it in terms of particular countries, focus on those countries that are particularly great at, cloud native, cloud, all of this stuff? Or do you know of any organizations that actually specifically focus on, recruiting developers from Africa, anything on those lines?
Yes, I know about one of them, which is called Talent QL. I think you can find them at talentql.com. They're focused on trying to recruit Africans into different companies. And then there's also Andela as well, which is focused on recruiting like software engineers and designers, if I'm not mistaken. But in a general sense, I think that Africans are people who are very like motivated and intentional about like doing well in like, whichever situations they find themselves. Maybe because of how like we've generally grown up, right? Like most African countries are not the best or not at their full potential, right? So we've not had as much let's say luxury or freedom like most people in other countries, right? So I think that just kind of makes you want to put your best foot out to do your best. So I think that Africans are one of the most hardworking people that I know. So I do think that having any African from any country, actually, I mean, I know that the tech ecosystem in Nigeria, Nairobi, Ghana, South Africa are doing well, but I also bet there are other fantastic engineers in other African countries. So I wouldn't necessarily say, hey, stick to the certain countries, but I mean, just find anybody who works for you.
All right. And, finally, last question for you, just talking about women in tech. What, according to you, is something unique that women can bring to tech as part of a team? What kind of perspective, in your opinion, is something that women bring to tech?
I think, I mean, it's like, it's different, right? When you are like, everybody has their own identity, their own experiences, right? From like growing up. And I feel like just having a woman on the team just helps to get these different opinions in, right? Because, hey, we're all just men, then you think in a certain way, right? It doesn't always apply, right? But sometimes most men think in a certain way. But once a woman shares her own opinion on something, then it can just bring a new light to how they should go about approaching, let's say, fixing a bug, creating a certain product, or marketing a certain product. It could be different things. I think it's very important to have a diversified team where they're like it's inclusive, right? It's not just about like male or female. It's like people of color, people who are like from Asia, like just having different experiences, different people just helps create a more holistic view around what you're doing, what you could be doing, or how to approach certain things.
All right. Yeah, that was great. Very inspiring to hear all of those. I really enjoyed talking with you today, Edidiong. Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much for just sharing all of those ideas. I'm really excited to see all that you're working on. And how can someone connect with you? Where are you most active on?
I'm most active on Twitter at
All right.
Didicodes. Yes, DIDICODES. Yes.
All right, cool. Yeah, so viewers, that's how you can connect with Edidiong, and definitely check out the stuff that she's working on with Telepresence. So with that, we come to the end of another fantastic interview with a really interesting guest. And if you like what you heard, definitely head over to amazic.com and check out all of our other interviews that we've done with various other vendors in the cloud native Kubernetes space. So that said, that's all we have for you today. Thank you so much again for joining us. Signing off for now. Thank you again, Edidiong.
Thanks for having me.
Dwayne. All right.